Well, hello, everybody. My name is Rob Fenstermacher, and I'm the co-president of the Robert Bosch Foundation Alumni Association. I'm also the chief content officer at the American Council on Germany. We're really pleased today to launch this new virtual event series, ZoomAtlantic Dialogues, which will be a four-part series of conversations that will be covering key transatlantic issues for our community. The initiative is meant to showcase alumni from a variety of transatlantic fellowship programs, including the Robert Bosch Foundation Fellowship Program, the American Council on Germany's Young Leader Program, as well as the Congress Bundestag Youth Exchange for Young Professionals. It's a collaborative effort of the Robert Bosch Foundation Alumni Association, the American Council on Germany, Cultural Vistas, as well as the GIZ, the Gesellschaft für internationale Zusammenarbeit. These are the various organizations that are responsible for managing these organizations. And while many of our organizations are already doing a number of these kind of virtual event series, we felt it was really important to create a new series that highlighted, as I mentioned, the expertise of the alumni in these transatlantic exchanges, as well as create a series that was targeting the alumni from these exchanges as the individuals that got to participate and be part of the live discussion. So we're really excited to engage all of you in today's conversation, as well as the future events we have planned over the next month and a half. So to kick off our series today on the topic of the news media in Germany and the United States during a pandemic, we have two journalists with us today, one based in Berlin, one based in Washington, D.C. First, we have Sumi Somaskanda. She was a Bosch Fellow in 2008-2009. She's a freelance reporter, writer, editor, and news anchor who's worked with a number of different organizations. She's been based in Berlin for about a decade now, or more than a decade actually, and she's currently a news anchor with DW News, or Deutsche Welle. So welcome, Sumi. Glad you could be with us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
In Washington, we have Daniel Lippman. He was an American Council on Germany Young Leader in 2017. And he's a reporter covering the White House in Washington for Politico. And prior to joining Politico, he worked for McClatchy as well as the Wall Street Journal. So we're really pleased to have you with us as well, Daniel. Thanks.
Thank you for having me.
So right now, the COVID-19 pandemic is obviously dominating the news around the world, since it's obviously impacted almost any topic that you might be wanting to talk about in the news media, and that what you would normally be covering. And it's also clearly the biggest story in everyone's lives, given the impact it's having on our daily lives. So I'd like to start the conversation by asking each of you to give a kind of a general sense of how the news media in each country is dealing with the flood of information and the various stories that you could be reporting on. You know, could you maybe talk, what are the two or three main issues that you find the news media is focusing on? And is that being driven by the need to really be providing critical information to all of us? Or is it being driven by, you know, news industry is entertainment on some level? Are you trying to get the most viewers? So maybe we'll start with you, Sumi, and hear a little bit of, you know, how is Deutsche Welle dealing with this? And are there differences? Also, to go a little deeper, you know, are different media outlets covering it in different ways?
Yeah, so I'll start, Rob, with DW Deutsche Welle, where I work. I should say that we are considered the international broadcaster. So although we're part of the German media landscape, we are primarily broadcasting to, or you know, we have users online as well who are across the world. And our biggest user base and viewer base is actually in Asia and in Africa. And I think that DW has really seen its mandate as becoming an information provider, a provider of reliable, factual information that people can turn to during this pandemic, and it's been massively successful. So there were, I think we hit beyond the 1 billion mark users, digital users and viewers in March alone. And that is from the daily news content, from, you know, the YouTube channel and Facebook. There's a daily COVID-19 special as well. And you could just see this massive appetite for information. So again, that's kind of the German perspective on the pandemic being broadcast to the world. As for German media, which obviously I watch very closely as well, I'd say since about early March, late February, early March, you've seen really monothematic coverage of this pandemic, as you would expect. Rob, you'll know the Tagesschau, which is the nightly newscast here on the public broadcaster, is 15 minutes long, and it is the only topic dominating news coverage. You know, here and there you do see some other stories come in. But I think what the media has done very effectively, German media, from broadcasters to the online media and also the print media, radio, is to really communicate a sense of urgency. I should say that I think Germany is well poised to handle a crisis like this, not only on the health and economic side, but also in terms of information. There is a pretty high level of trust in government institutions, social trust, but also in experts. And so in a scientific crisis or a health crisis where you need to rely on experts' advice, that is something that has been communicated fairly well and received fairly well. And I should say also that that urgency was quite tragically helped by the fact that by late February, early March, beamed across German screens were these catastrophic images of what was happening in Italy, which is so close. And just a few weeks earlier, a lot of Germans were also skiing with Italians in the same region. So it was very clear early on that this is something that could hit Germany very hard. So there's been a lot of communication on that end. The government has been really front and center in speaking with the public regularly. Chancellor Merkel delivered a really rare direct address to the public on March 18th. This is something she never does, only on New Year's Eve, and that's a very different address. And so they have been really available to the public, regular press conferences. This was a big criticism of the government in 2015 during the migration crisis, that they weren't transparent. And so you've seen open access to media was something that they've taken advantage of and covered regularly. And then also, I'd like to say there's been a big focus on the science. There is, like Dr. Fauci in the US, there is a star virologist here, somebody who's kind of really a cult hero. Christian Drosten is his name. He's someone you would see in press conferences with the Chancellor, with the Health Minister, Jens Spahn. And he actually, in late February already, started a daily podcast. He's being interviewed by a science journalist that has 1 million regular downloads. And if you can imagine, this is a man who is involved in the scientific community worldwide and covering in response to this outbreak. And he sits down for 30 minutes a day to talk about the latest developments in this virus and has been massively successful in that. So I'd say across the spectrum, media here have been very much focused on policy making and the science, but also, of course, covering how this is all affecting the community and the economy and local businesses. So it's been a broad range.
And maybe one follow-up question before I turn to Daniel to hear the US perspective. What's happened to, quote, normal stories? I mean, are any normal stories even coming out anymore? Or is just everything wall-to-wall COVID-19 related kind of stories?
It is pretty much wall-to-wall COVID stories. So there are a few stories that have gotten attention. For example, Germany banning Hezbollah. I think this was last week. There have been a few stories of kind of prominent celebrity deaths that have received some attention. But the human interest stories, even the private broadcasters who focus on more entertainment news or focusing on Corona-based entertainment news. What are celebrities doing during the lockdown? What do you cook during the lockdown? And so wall-to-wall, but wall-to-wall coverage looks different in Germany. There's a lot less shouting. I think the aesthetic of that is also pretty sober.
Okay, thanks. Daniel, maybe similar question to you. How is, looking at the United States, I don't want to turn to the political side of things. We will talk about that a little bit later, but maybe you could also tell us a little bit about, what are the main stories that are being presented on here, and are media outlets, across the spectrum covering the same issues, which Sumi was touching on a little bit here as well.
No, yeah, that's totally right. But it feels like it's kind of divided up into 3 different categories of news where it's been about the lack of preparation from the US government side. They didn't have enough ventilators, they didn't have enough masks, they were kind of caught flat-footed. And even now there's not enough testing. That's a huge aspect of the news, because unless you get a proper number of tests every day or every week, then you can't fully reopen and you can't know where the virus is going. And I think another part has just been the response, how, tales from the hospital, talking to doctors, people who have recovered from COVID-19, and how the Trump administration has been fighting with governors, And as part of that response, you kind of see those daily coronavirus briefings that Trump has done, which he has kind of stopped for the last week because he was getting so much criticism and his poll numbers were declining. And I think another aspect is the reopening. Even though the numbers have kind of plateaued in many states and even are rising in 20 states, a lot of Americans are eager to get back to work. The economic toll has been so tough with tens of millions of people thrown off their jobs, and you have the social welfare state is not as strong as in Europe, and so people who you wouldn't expect, they're going to food banks, and there's TV footage of miles of cars waiting all night to get into food banks. And I think a lot of Americans are concerned because usually the U.S. is the leader in a type of response like this, where everyone looks to us to kind of lead the way. And here we have many more cases and deaths per capita than in many other countries. And so that's, and you have a President Trump with the America First agenda who isn't as interested in leading the way internationally, and he is trying to save this country and save his reelection bid, frankly. And so that is some of the themes that we're seeing these days.
So Daniel, you just touched on the reelection theme, and I think many people argue that the pandemic obviously should not be a political issue because the coronavirus has the potential to affect anybody, infect anybody regardless of what your political persuasion might be or your political views. And that especially during a crisis, it's critical that everyone be working across parties, so bipartisan here in the United States and across the many parties in Germany. But given what you mentioned, that we're in the midst of a US presidential campaign, and even prior to that, that so many issues in the United States all seem to be seen through a political lens at this point, it seems like a lot of the coverage or the responses are political in nature as we talk about COVID-19. And I know Politico is a publication that focuses a lot on politics. So I'm curious, how is Politico and how do other media outlets kind of balance the need to be providing, the accurate, unbiased information that citizens need, to plan, to keep their families safe, with the spin that frankly all political parties try and do when they're talking about these issues, and maybe trying to use it against their political opponents. And sort of related to this, how do news media keep politicians accountable for the information that they're providing? Again, regardless of what the political persuasion may be.
Yeah, I think it's, my job hasn't changed too much. I think it's even more important to hold politicians accountable, especially at a time of national crisis. And so, it's fact-checking statements by the president and his health experts and other administration officials. So Jared Kushner is in charge of getting enough supplies for the response. And so, we try to ask tough questions. Are they actually doing that properly? Why haven't they invoked a law called the Defense Production Act to mandate from the government side to have private companies make enough test swabs and make enough, ventilators and masks? And so I think it's, accountability journalism, people are very interested in that. And so I've done a couple stories. I looked at how the Trump transition, when they were coming off of the Obama term, they were all warned that they could get a large pandemic on their hands originating from Asia. And, there would be lack of ventilators and lack of respirators. And so, and we got copies of the actual handbook that was given to all of the top Trump officials who were in this large meeting where this game scenario was kind of played out. I did another story about how the Department of Homeland Security, they stopped modeling for pandemics a couple of years ago in 2018. And so, people weren't very happy about that story because it was kind of, hindsight is 2020, of course, but this has been something that has kept up experts late at night for years. People like Lori Garrett, who is, writing books on this. And so kind of all the warning signs were there. Bill Gates talks about it a lot. So I think it's kind of looking at the promises that the government is making, say 4 million tests per day by a certain date, and then lo and behold, there's not, the tests have not kind of hit that level yet. And so, Trump says a lot of things that are not true, and so it's important to fact check that in real time, and to challenge him in briefings and on Twitter and on TV.
And Sumi, I guess a similar question to you is there a similar issue happening in Germany? Is politics playing a huge role in the coverage, and are parties, trying to use this to position themselves? We've seen there's been a huge shift in the polls in terms of the support for the various political parties. So I'm curious, are parties now trying to react to those changes in the polls in how they respond or criticize other parties around the pandemic?
Well, I think it's important to make the distinction from early on in the pandemic and the first weeks of I called it relative lockdown because it's not a complete lockdown here, the measures that were taken by the federal and state governments, and to the point that we are now. So in the early weeks, there was such a broad, it seemed, consensus across the German public that the measures that the government was taking was working. They were working, and quite frankly, Germany has seen a very positive development in infection rates and the ability of the health system to cope with the cases that it has seen. And so, because Germany has had this positive development, I think that there wasn't much politicizing of the pandemic early on. Now it's been 6-7 weeks in, and what you've seen in this past week is this clamoring to reopen, to send children back to school because parents are having more difficulty, obviously, watching their kids and working from home, to open particularly restaurants and cafes again, businesses that are really suffering and having a hard time getting through. The fact that you see 10.1 million workers who applied for furlough, so that's such a massive number, and the realization that the long-term knock-on effects of this crisis are going to be so deep and significant. And with this clamoring to reopen, you've seen the politicizing of this debate again. So you've seen on the far right AFD, also on far left elements, protests in the public here in Berlin as well, but on Twitter, very much a debate over whether or when Germany should reopen. And on the far right and far left, that debate or that discussion is being had in a pretty extreme fashion. And there's a call for Chancellor Merkel to reopen as soon as possible, and it's seen as a failure of hers. And so that's where you've seen these political lines now reopening. But in the early weeks of this crisis, you saw the far right AFD really slip in the polls, and as you mentioned, Rob, this huge boost for the governing parties, and that hasn't really ebbed, quite frankly. And we have to see how that changes. These Sunday polls that are taken once a week, we have to see if that shifts at all as the days and weeks stretch on. But the attempt to politicize this pandemic hasn't been nearly as successful as in other countries because Germany and the government's measures seem to have worked fairly well.
Yeah, we've kind of seen the opposite here a little bit because Trump has seen his poll numbers, ebb and flow a little bit. I think he hit, a pretty good number for him in Gallup. I think it's high 40s, but only 37% of Americans think the country is on the right track, which is a number that pollsters are always looking for, because if it's under 50, then that often means that the incumbent is going to lose. But after 9/11, George W. Bush, his poll ratings went up to 90%, almost immediately, because he was seen as a strong leader, and he, had a good message, and he was seen as having a good response, and fighting back against the terrorists in Afghanistan. Of course, that changed when the Iraq War happened, but we have not seen a similar, poll upswing from Trump. A lot of Democrats, they are totally against him, and even Republicans, they have been concerned at the response by Trump, who has, has kind of a strong distrust of experts and scientists, and even the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta, they have had budget cuts in the last few years as Trump hasn't, fully, he said no one could have predicted this. Of course, there are people predicting it, but even Democrats like New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio, he was in mid-March, he was saying, well, we can continue, or early March, he was saying we can, go about your daily lives like nothing has changed.
So to follow up on something both of you just touched on a little bit is, I think the news media for a long time at the beginning, and obviously until a few weeks ago, was really focused on the impact and the very many sad stories of people dying and the really negative economic impact that this was having on everybody. But I think, as you mentioned, Daniel, I think with President Trump, there's now a desire to start shifting, the conversation, if you will, towards we need to start reopening, trying to put things behind us in terms of the worst side of the pandemic so far. So I'm curious if both of you could maybe speak a little bit, how does the media start to make this shift? And do they have a responsibility to continue to keep a focus on, still the tragedy side of things and the issues that are going wrong, but also start to recognize that, things are going to improve and start focusing more on that? Maybe, Daniel, maybe you can start and then
Sure.
Sumi.
Yeah, I think we've already seen that shift. If you look at Politico's coverage or the New York Times, you have a lot of stories about the reopening. And so you can have both the stories about the medical and the tragic side, but also the economic side, which is a huge part in this country. And so, but I think as the deaths can go from 65,000 to 66, 67 and higher, we're expecting probably 75 to 100,000. That's what Trump said yesterday. The sad fact is that it's not as eye-catching to viewers and readers. It becomes kind of just a growing number that people don't even want to think about. But they, news is, the word new is in it. So we have to kind of focus on looking at the efforts to get the vaccine, to get a treatment. You're seeing big stories on that, but also you can still focus on the response, but you just have to find a new angle. You have to find stuff that has not been reported. That's kind of my bailiwick, where I'm not on Twitter almost any part of the day except in the evening or early in the morning to kind of read up on what's going on. But my days are filled with calling sources and trying to break news instead of just kind of chasing the soccer ball about what happened 10 minutes ago. And so it's kind of a liberating feeling, but it's also you have more impact with your stories if you're kind of breaking totally new ground instead of just kind of following what other people are reporting.
And Sumi, is it similar now? I mean, you touched on the fact that there's this desire to really open things up again. How are the media dealing with that?
Yeah, I mean, so I should say from the beginning, German media were, of course, also critical of government policies. In the beginning, it was more discussion over, so Germany has 16 states, and there was a wide debate over whether the measures taken that are implemented on the state level were coordinated enough. And that was the main focus of debate. Then it moved on to, solidarity with Italy and mutualized debt, also coverage of mis and disinformation. But this issue and this question of this fine line between civil liberties and freedom and the need to protect the greater good and the public health of the society has been an element of coverage from the beginning. And I remember quite early on reading an essay in a leading newspaper written by a member of the Free Democrats, which is the business-friendly, let's say, libertarian party here, warning that yes, it's important to protect public health, but it's also important to make sure that this is not a backsliding into the government taking control of parts of our public sphere that it shouldn't. And what you've seen in the past week is that public opinion, as that public opinion has shifted more and more towards this need to reopen society and the economy, you've seen more and more coverage of that in the media as well. And I always say that in Germany, the best bellwether of public opinion and what's the current debate is a political talk show. So there are these 4 or 5 main political talk shows a week that are have large viewership, and last night Anna Will is one of the big ones on Sunday nights, and it is a constant topic now. Is when is it the right time to open up? And that is of course still being balanced with what we're hearing from biologists like Christian Drosten, who brought out a study about how infectious children are seen to be now, and there's conflicting information there. So I think part of the frustration and the need to move forward is because there are so many unanswered questions still, and people are just ready to move forward.
Great. So I just wanted to remind folks that are listening or watching that if you have questions, you can submit it to rbfaa@culturalvistas.org or put your question into the Zoom chat. And I guess I'll bring in a question that's there now with a question I had. There's been a lot of talk about international collaboration around this and whether or not there's been enough. So one of the questions that has come in is have you felt there's been enough EU cooperation in terms of the response to COVID-19 or international cooperation? And I think related to that, there's obviously a lot of news now, just a lot yesterday, related to China, of course. How much have they collaborated, or how much are they the reason why this has happened, especially in the news media here? So maybe I'll start with you, Sumi, first, the question of cooperation within the EU, but is the topic of China and their responsibility in this also coming into the conversation as well, into news media?
So EU cooperation has been spotty. There, from in the very first weeks of this pandemic, we saw Germany, for example, stopping exports of critical medical equipment that it needed, and closure of borders or checks along the border, and that caused a lot of anger within the EU, especially for Germany's neighbors, for France, and that is still an issue of contention. On the other hand, you have seen Germany fly over patients from Italy to be treated in German hospitals because there's a higher ICU capacity. And today there is this big pledge drive, so fundraising drive led by the European Commission, by the President Ursula von der Leyen, to raise money. 7.5 billion euros, excuse me, was the goal for funding of vaccine efforts. The one country that is lacking from that effort, of course, is the US. And so that is, of course, something that is missing from the international cooperation, at least from the EU's perspective at this point. On the China question, the EU has been fairly reserved up until about this week in its judgment of China, and very cautious in its language because there are such strong and deep economic ties, right? So for Germany, the car market in China is its most important. And also China has been sending medical supplies to places like the Netherlands and Italy, and also Germany. Some of those supplies, we should say, have been defective and have to be returned. But regardless, that aid has been praised. So, but this week we've seen more and more European leaders and also the Commission President Ursula von der Leyen calling for transparency from China to help get to the bottom of the origin of this virus. And that is more and more in line with what we've seen coming from the White House. There's still, when it comes to the theory of how the virus started, sticking with the WHO and continue to fund the WHO is an important way to stop the pandemic or stop it from spreading in poorer countries. But there you do see more of an alignment with the US.
Daniel, how about a perspective from the US?
Sure. So yeah, I think it's, we're seeing like a full court press against China from the US government. And some people think that is because, or one reason is to kind of distract Americans from the shortfalls in the Trump administration's response, where if we can talk about someone else to blame, blame shift, then that will help Trump get reelected. And so I think there is a, some Trump officials, people were kind of pulling their hair out at how the US is going to withdraw funding for the WHO, and that would only make the WHO more responsive to what China wants. China would only become more influential if the US is not part of that. And so, but Trump does not like international organizations often, and so the WHO is kind of on his naughty list. But in terms of other international cooperation, I think we're seeing the UN Security Council and the UN as a whole, they don't seem as engaged on this crisis, from the Secretary General or from New York, from their headquarters. And so that's been something that's been noteworthy, that they're kind of MIA here, to the detriment of the world. And I think we're wondering about a vaccine, if if the race for, once a vaccine is kind of identified and approved, to actually ramp up to get billions of doses, we're probably going to see the same type of scramble that we have seen for masks and for other PPE and ventilators, where it's every country and every state for themselves. And so that's something that's coming down the pike that is pretty concerning. Another thing I've covered is the efforts of USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development. They have kind of been missing in action as well a little bit, because the Trump administration didn't want them to be giving stuff and aid that we needed for ourselves, but there is an effort to reverse that. And Trump has talked about how he's the king of ventilators now. And so he's going to just give ventilators to, foreign countries that need it, to try to help stem the virus from spreading in those developing countries.
So I'm gonna stay on the China theme for a moment, given that we got another question on it. I know it's not necessarily the focus of your background and on media, but a question came in on whether or not you think the COVID crisis is going to mark the beginning of a Chinese era, and how the impact will be on U.S.-German relationships with China. You mentioned that, Sumi, a little bit in your response. But how is this, a little longer term, if we start to think things out in the future, going to impact the relationships with China?
I think that's a great question, an incredibly complex question, because there are so many things at play here. So even before this pandemic began, there was a lot of anger in the U.S. over Germany's decision to push ahead with Huawei to build out the 5G network here, because it's an important part of being able to finance and build out that infrastructure. And you've seen also, Germany launch a lot of strategic partnerships with China on various fronts, especially economic partnerships. And as I said, there are very deep economic interests for Germany and China. And so that has been a bit of a wedge between the US and Germany in their approach to China. What I think you're starting to see now in Germany and also in the European Union is a realization that textures of the Trump administration's approach and really tough line on China have perhaps some truth for the European Union as well. You've seen some significant reporting this week in Politico about this massive social media offensive launched by Chinese diplomats across Europe to criticize some of the reporting that European media in different countries have seen, or some of the messaging that some countries have been delivering on China's role in this outbreak. And we've seen really strong pushback from China. And you can see that clearly that's not welcomed by the European Union, but even to the point where China was threatening to take back supplies that it had sent to the Netherlands because of the renaming of an office to Taipei. And so as that influence, as it becomes more and more clear that some of that economic goodwill comes with strings attached, it's becoming what I think could be a real turning point for the European Union to redefine how Germany as well, sees its relationship to China, that it cannot just be an economic partner, that there are political aspects to that relationship, and that there might be some need to rethink how those business relationships continue. That being said, because Germany has such strong economic ties to China, I think it could also be a dividing factor within the European Union, that some countries call for a tougher line to China, and some countries like Germany say, we still need that market for German cars. So that's why I'm calling it a turning point. If this is going to be a Chinese era, the European Union is going to have to act together to define what that era looks like.
And Daniel, again, similar question to you. I mean, we've obviously now for the last 2-3 years had a rather antagonistic relationship with China. And as you mentioned, there is now an effort to kind of push the blame on China. So, how is this going to continue to play out? Is there a way to bring it back under control, or is it potentially going to snowball and get even worse?
Well, I think in terms of it, the question whether it's going to be a China era, I think there's a lot of skepticism in the West and in the US about that, because China is seen as the place that where the virus originated. So if there's a lot of feeling that they should have just taken care of it. They should have not tried to cover it up. And then they could have probably contained it to Wuhan or, 1 or 2 provinces. without it spreading across the world, where they weren't taking proper steps, and they didn't. The local officials, they are, there's no free media in China, not really at least, and there's, the local officials get blamed if they have bad news on their watch, and so even if it could snowball, then they, most of the time they know that if they just cover it up, then it won't actually, no one will notice, or Beijing won't find out. And so there is a, that's kind of front and center. And also I think it's, we're lacking sometimes good reporting from China because of the expulsions of top journalists from the Washington Post, from the New York Times, from the Wall Street Journal, that just happened in the last month and a half or so. And so there is, Secretary of State Pompeo, he actually admitted to to a couple top media figures that it was wrong for the State Department, or he would have probably done it differently, for the State Department to punish some Chinese local journalists who were in the U.S., requiring them to register, as foreign agents, and then that led China to kick out the Western journalists. And so he doesn't really often show any contrition or kind of apology, and he didn't do that publicly, but it got out in the New York Times, and so that was pretty noteworthy. That we have to keep Americans and Brits in China as much as we can to report on what's going on, and because oftentimes the open source reporting, that's better than a lot of the intelligence that that makes its way into classified briefings, because journalists can ask anyone questions, and if you're an asset of a foreign country or work for the CIA, you can't. You're going to have less access to some of the hospitals and some of the urologists.
So I want to take a little shift back to trust in media, and that issue on both sides of the Atlantic. I'm going to start with you, Daniel. There was a recent poll, I think it came out last week, from the Associated Press NORC Center for Public Affairs Research, that found that 6 in 10 Americans say they regularly get information on COVID-19 from the news media, which is a good thing. That's 60%. However, while the news media is cited as the most frequented source of information, it's one of the least trusted. About a third say that they have high trust in information, and roughly another third says a moderate amount. So there's a higher trust of information provided by local government leaders and health officials, as opposed to directly from the news media. So could you talk a little bit about how you think the news media can perhaps regain trust of the public? And is it tied at all with sort of the downfall, if you will, of local media here in the United States, where a lot of local media outlets have either gone bankrupt or have been taken over by larger national news outlets? And so is this lack of trust a little bit also an issue because there are no longer these locally trusted news media outlets that people would get that information from?
I think it's a very good question. And, I think we have to kind of factor in the decades of politicians, and especially President Trump, who calls the media the enemy of the people and fake news, that if you do that so often and very frequently, that will have an impact on people distrusting national media outlets or even local media outlets. They kind of just group all media as just the media, or I saw it on the news. And so I think this pandemic might kind of reverse some of those trends, where people see, journalists trying to do their level best to get the news out there and to help local communities. We're kind of in the essential worker category, so I can go out and about to talk to sources, although I'm not doing that often. So I think we have a real responsibility that people are recognizing. You're seeing subscription numbers up for some of the top publications. Politico launched a newsletter called Politico Nightly, which is all about the coronavirus pandemic, and with kind of packed with new stuff that our readers would want to find out about at the end of the day. And TV ratings are through the roof. But local, local news organizations often don't have the business model that supports them. And so I think one way to do that is to have nonprofits kind of support some of these organizations and start new ones. But in terms of getting a trust back, there's no silver bullet that you can only do so much in terms of kind of explaining how you go about getting stories and how you cover the news, and the importance of anonymous sources sometimes, because you're not going to get federal workers. And I'm doing a story right now about where I talked to a number of civil servants. They're not going to want to get fired if I put their names in the story. And so that is something that is a real, you kind of have to, there's something called news literacy, where you, which is happening in high schools all around the country, where kids are kind of taught how to separate legitimate news sources and what they see on Facebook or on Instagram, where you shouldn't necessarily trust that information.
So Sumi, last week I watched one of these virtual conversations on Zoom, and one of the speakers was Stefan Cornelius, who's the foreign editor of the German daily Süddeutsche Zeitung. And he commented that he thought the state of journalism in Germany today was better than ever. He said, it seemed like people revalued it more than they ever have in the past, that it's appreciated for the information that it's providing. So do you agree with that assessment? Do you get a sense that there's a higher trust in news media in Germany compared to what we just heard a little bit from Daniel and the survey I just mentioned to you?
So yes, definitely there is a higher trust in news media and institutions in public broadcasters. If you allow the brief digression, if I could just explain briefly the media landscape and how it differs here a bit, is it very much is built or embedded in this post-war legacy of creating really balanced, critical, good journalism. You do see great journalism across the spectrum, but it is also still also tied very much to the mainstream power politics of Germany. So even if you have newspapers, like you mentioned, Süddeutsche or FAZ, who they really are, across the spectrum in terms of their perspectives, from conservative to more liberal to left-wing, they more or less follow the line of what is considered mainstream politics. And they also see their role as having to protect democratic values, right? So this is part of this post-war legacy. And part of that legacy is, or part of politics here, is consensus. And so media has also largely been shaped by this culture of consensus. That all started to really crumble in 2015 with the migration crisis. That was a huge crisis for media in Germany as well, in part because the public broadcasters, as you know, Rob, here in Germany carry huge weight, right? So they have huge funding because each German household pays a licensing fee. And in their coverage of the migration crisis, there was a lot of what I believe warranted criticism of lapses in judgment and how they covered the crisis early on, in covering refugees and migrants in a very positive light, in what is considered a biased light, and undercovering or underreporting stories or a series of crimes, most notably New Year's Eve mass sexual assault in Cologne, that was undercovered, not even really reported on the main broadcasters until a day too later. They would say not intentionally, but for editorial reasons. Regardless, that really eroded trust in the public broadcasters. So if you come from that point where trust has actually slowly been ebbing from what you would call mainstream media, to this point where all of a sudden these broadcasters are again seeing a huge spike in their viewership and their users, media as well, and newspapers as well, like the Süddeutsche, although they haven't really been able to capitalize that into a financial boost. But I think that's a journalism problem in general, that more people than ever want good, reliable information, but somehow they're not able to, the media outlets aren't able to capitalize. So they're coming from this lower point in confidence, and now reaching this point where people are turning back to them. And I would agree with that statement, that it seems like that trust is especially high right now.
Good to hear. At least there's some trust in media someplace. So I guess we're getting closer to the end, so I do want to remind if there's any last minute questions that folks have, please send them in via the chat. So I'll maybe ask each of you a final sort of two-part question. One, if you had to give the media in each of the countries that you're currently in kind of a grade on how they've handled the reporting around the pandemic, on a scale of 1 to 10, what would you give them? And then somewhat related is, what do you think the long-term impact of this crisis is going to be on the news media? I mean, there's a lot of conversations about how this is going to change all sorts of different things in our society, whether it's business travel, the way certain business models are set up, given that we might have to be dealing with this for a longer period of time. So I'm curious, and have you thought a little bit about this? Is the journalism community thinking about this? How are you all going to be impacted in the longer term because of this? And maybe I'll start with you, Daniel.
Sure. I think I would give the media, a pretty high grade, a 9 out of that. Kind of
and you're not biased, right?
Not biased at all. And I think if some surveys, I haven't seen the latest one, but people had always talked about how the media was, not as, trustworthy, but we've seen an uptick last year at least. I don't know how that's changed recently. But I think the long-term effects is that a lot of local papers are not going to come back. If you're deprived of advertising, if you have to kind of temporarily shut down for several months, they're like any other type of businesses where you can't really start up again unless you have a booming economy again. And so they'll lose talent, and you're going to see a consolidation more where people get news from major national outlets and not as much local outlets. And so that has a deteriorating impact on society, because say if you're a voter or just a resident of Montana and you only have 1 or 2 reporters who are full-time covering the state legislature, then those politicians will feel less of a they'll feel like reporters are breathing down their necks less. And so they, if you're worried about getting caught, then you're more apt to be a better public servant. And if you feel like no one is going to spot you or uncover any kind of shady stuff that you're doing, or you're not doing your job, or doing local investigative journalism, then services will decline, and people will just lose trust in their governments as well if they feel like they're not getting the proper side of the story. And so I think it's one of the local papers in Western Massachusetts, the Berkshire Record that I worked for in high school, they just announced that they were closing down, at least temporarily. And so that it's kind of hitting home for a lot of people. I've known journalists who lost their jobs and been laid off. Thankfully at Politico we haven't had any impacts, but I think everyone is tightening their belt to try to get through this.
Thanks. And Sumi, how about Germany?
Yeah, I would also give a fairly high grade. I maybe an 8 or a 9. I have a hard time giving grades. I'd be a terrible teacher, I think. But what the crisis has certainly laid bare is to the points that we've heard already in general. This has been a crisis. The media has been in crisis for quite some time in terms of being able to secure their financial future. And I think what this has laid bare is the fact that they haven't, or many media outlets have missed the boat when it comes to switching from an advertising-based revenue stream to subscriptions. And that's something that's been happening here in Germany slower than in the US, I would say, but it's also been happening here. And of course, media companies here are just as affected by the downturn in the economy as any other company. And so you've seen also, I have colleagues at big German publications here who, let's say they cover sports or culture, who have been furloughed for the time being. And they're not sure if their positions will exist, or they hope that they will when they come back. I hope it doesn't lead to a further consolidation of the media landscape, because I think that it's so important to keep that diverse spectrum of voices and opinion. But I fear that it could just exacerbate what we've already seen across the media landscape. And what I would hope could happen here is also a push towards more transparency, because what is lacking to me in German journalism, I would say in general, is it has a bit of an elitist perspective that it's somewhat top down, or has been in the past at least. And I think the 2015 migration crisis and the criticism afterwards has remedied that a little bit. But I think this is an opportunity for German media to open more to discussions with users and readers and viewers and listeners, and to engage them more in the discussion, and also to engage them more in the debate about how they decide what they cover and why. And I would think this is a good opportunity to do precisely that.
Excellent. So we do have a little more time, and another question came in, which I think touches a little bit on this, maybe talking about mainstream journalism versus social media. But the question is talking about, why has it been during this crisis, perhaps, if you agree with this statement, that conspiracy theories have taken greater hold? Whether it's the 5G towers actually spreading the virus, which I think is actually, from my reading, been even bigger in Europe in general, where there have been arson attacks against the towers, et cetera. But also, whether or not China created the virus in a lab, et cetera. Do you have a sense that this crisis has created more conspiracy theories than at other times, or not? Maybe Sumi, I'll start with you.
Yeah, that's a question I ask myself. I find it confounding to see so many conspiracies surrounding this crisis. And one I've actually heard, mentioned on the streets here, there in Germany, is the Bill Gates conspiracy, that he's looking to outfit us all with chips and to gain profit and whatnot. And I find that pretty remarkable. I don't know that it's really a product of media coverage. I think it's really more of a product of this being an all-encompassing crisis at a scale that we've simply not seen before, one that has affected every aspect of our life, that's global. And I think it is anxiety-inducing. And so people are looking for reasons for scapegoats. And these are perhaps easier answers than the fact that we simply don't know how things are going to look in 3 months' time. We don't know why this virus causes certain reactions in some patients and in others, and why some countries have handled it better and others have not. There are still a lot of open questions. And so I think that is perhaps, when there are uncertainties, a natural reaction.
Daniel, what's the sense here? I mean, there obviously are conspiracy theories in the US.
Yeah, I think it's people who are protesting some of the lockdowns and restrictions, that they are not, they're kind of viewing it as like a social Darwinian exercise, where if you're elderly, you should just stay home, and the rest of us, if you get infected, it's not that bad, or you often are not even symptomatic, and so you don't get any downside risk to that. And they're not actually following social distancing regulations when they are protesting, and they're not wearing masks. And so I think the individual strain and the individualistic strain in this country is such that we don't want to sometimes believe what the government is telling us, and we're looking for alternatives. And so I think there is a lot of skepticism. I think the skepticism about China is that because they have not been forthright for a long time about, they haven't let us, send teams into that lab to kind of verify their story, or the WHO has not been able to go there either. And so that breeds skepticism about whether, when there was cables from the State Department back to Washington a couple of years ago saying, hey, these labs are not, they're not following the biosafety measures, that leads people to wonder. And I think, Trump's rhetoric about bleach or, hydroxychloroquine, which is not proved to be a drug that actually works too much, that has fed into some of this distrust of science.
I want to thank you both for a great conversation today. I think we covered a lot of ground and a lot of topics, and you were both able to give us some really great insights about how the news media is being impacted, how it's dealing with this crisis in Germany and the US, and want to thank everybody who joined us as well for the conversation today and for your questions, and hope you will all join us as we continue this series. In 2 weeks, we have another conversation that'll be on a topic I think that Sumi might have mentioned, where we're talking about individual rights versus the common good, and how we're dealing with that during the crisis. And that's on May 18th. So I hope many of you will join us for that conversation. And again, thanks Sumi, thanks Daniel for taking the time today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Stay well, stay healthy, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.